It's when you're telling somebody that there's a steam train coming at you and there isn't one, and getting you to act. That's where you get into territory of deception and propaganda.
My name is Jeremy Prest, and I'm filling in for Leon today. Joining me in studio is Piers Robinson, one of the most learned people studying propaganda, its history and its manipulative use, and the changes in culture that are being influenced by the control and the shaping of information. One of the executive members of Panda and the editor of the online magazine called Propaganda in Focus. I'm excited to dive into this fascinating conversation.
Today, a special episode of Return to Reason, where knowledge and wisdom intersect.
Dr. Piers Robinson, it is so good to have you on our show today. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be with you.
As we were diving through a lot of your content, there's a lot to go through here, and I want to make sure that we can kind of pick your brain, kind of walk out some of these concepts when it comes to propaganda. So what would you say, what is propaganda?
Well, the way I define propaganda is that it's a form of persuasion. So it's a way of manipulating people's thoughts, beliefs, and also behavior, which operates in what I define as a non-consensual way. Yeah. Okay, so it's trying to get people to think something through perhaps deception, or to behave in a particular way by incentivizing them or even coercing them. Mm-hmm. But it's always against their own free will, and it's not a rational process of persuasion, for example. It's essentially manipulation. And that's distinguishable from, as it were, persuasion through consensual means, where you try to honestly give the facts and the information to somebody and give them a choice as to whether they want to believe something or not. There are others who tend to go for the argument that all persuasion is propaganda, any kind of attempting to get your argument across. But I don't think, for me, that's not a very helpful way of understanding it. Propaganda, and certainly the way it's come to be understood throughout the course of the 20th century, is that it is a manipulative, non-consensual process. And I like to keep sort of a space in there for saying, well, yeah, you can persuade people without engaging in propaganda. You can, go out there and give people all the facts and then try and put your case forward as honestly and accurately as you can and hope that people will be won over. And that's still persuasion.
What's the argument for persuasion? Because if someone's standing on a road and a car is heading their way and I'm trying to persuade them to get off the road, how can they even begin to argue that that's propaganda? If it's factual, I guess that's the question.
Oh, if it's factual and it's accurate, it's not propaganda. It's if you're warning somebody, if you're ringing the alarm bells that they're about to be harmed, for example, and it's true, then that's not propaganda. That's giving people the information they need in order to act accordingly. It's when you're telling somebody that there's a steam train coming at you and there isn't one, and getting you to act. That's where you get into territory of deception and propaganda.
Yeah, so I guess it all hinges on the fact if it's a fact or if it's true. Because I find whoever controls the knowledge has a tremendous amount of power. And that seems to be the trend in politics, in if you can control and not even just necessarily controlling knowledge, but also leading with fear. It almost is fear seems to be the driving factor for propaganda. So what would you say, what has history shown us about propaganda? What is there to learn in what history has shown us?
Well, of course, throughout the 20th century, the use of propaganda has been widespread, and it's been refined as well. And you can see it sort of with the emergence of mass communication and mass literacy. You can see with people such as Eddie Bernays, Walter Lippmann, openly discussing in the first part of the 20th century the importance of manipulating the minds of publics. Yeah. And this was, in a way, this is quite an elitist conception of democracy. And it was the idea that, well, the masses, you can't have too much democracy, and populations need to be managed and led to a significant degree. And so this informed a lot of early thinking and theorizing about propaganda and about how it can be used. And in the First World War and the Second World War, of course, propaganda used extensively. It was, in fact, the case that following the way the Germans had used propaganda in the First World War, that Edward Bernays, who's considered the founding father of public relations, is cited as having said, well, we had a problem with continuing to use the word propaganda in order to explain our activities because the Germans had given it a bad name in the First World War. And so he said we had to come up with a new term, a rebranding, and that's where public relations comes from. And so what you see the kind of, sort of sidelining of the term propaganda and the increasing use of terms such as public relations, and then really an entire euphemism industry, which informed, so when we think of advertising, when we think of strategic communication or perception management, political communication, etc., these are all essentially other ways of describing techniques which had historically been labeled as propaganda. But you've also seen, in commerce, in the commercial world, you've seen the use of propaganda. Famously, I think it was Eddie Bernays sort of advised on the campaigns to encourage women to smoke cigarettes in the early part of the 20th century. And then, as some have pointed out, that the tobacco industry spent considerable resources on propaganda trying to stem emerging understanding of the link between smoking and cancer, for example. So you have industry and commerce employing propaganda, tools of manipulation to try to shore up their own interests. And those are some of the big examples, certainly from the 20th century. Come the 21st century, in the realm of international politics and war, the global war on terror has been associated with very high levels of propaganda. And now, as we go into the COVID phase, with growing recognition across multiple spheres that propaganda is being used extensively. And
it's a slippery slope. If you question things a little too much, you're kind of pushed into the conspiracy theory side, and there is a ditch over on that side, but there's also a ditch on the other side of questioning nothing. So, what would be your suggestion to somebody when interpreting information? Like, how can we tell the difference between propaganda or not?
Well, I mean, the first point there about sort of, okay, what are we talking about? Sort of not wanting to be accused of being a conspiracy theorist and so on. And of course, that's as almost a propaganda tool in its own right, used to close down people who are asking critical questions. Yep. And I tend to say is that, people often think of a caricature when they hear the term conspiracy theory. And they think of a small group of people planning high levels of intentionality, etc. But really what you're talking about with propaganda and manipulation is simply that powerful actors do get together and they do coordinate information campaigns. And this often involves levels of deception, levels of incentivization and coercion in order to get people to act in a particular way.
What's their motive on that? Like, why would actors who already have money, who already have power, what's their interest, do you think?
Well, the example of the tobacco industry is a good one. The tobacco industry trying to stem the tide of awareness of the link between between smoking rather, and lung cancer. Very large vested interests there, huge money involved. And it's in their interest to try to maintain their profit margins by delaying awareness as long as possible. And of course, in that case, for the tobacco industry, they were very successful. In cases of war, it is always very difficult to mobilize populations to support war. Most people generally speaking, don't like wars. And what you find, certainly during the Cold War, is that a lot of the conflicts that were fought, certainly by liberal democracies, were conflicts which probably weren't consistent with their own liberal norms. So if you have to tell lies to fight the wars which you think are necessary, then you tell the lies, and you tell the lies to your populations. And again, I think you have, in the realm of foreign policy, you have a kind of realpolitik mentality, which I've seen in terms of my interface with foreign policy establishment, that, well, we've got to do some tough, nasty things in the world, and the publics probably won't support it, so we tell them little lies. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, whatever the motivations in relation to the invasion of Iraq, wasn't being driven by weapons of mass destruction, but that was the way in which it could be sold, and it was the way in which it could be sold to the American public and also more broadly to the international community to legitimate it. But that had to involve deception, because there was not a weapons of mass destruction threat from Iraq.
So in order for that to happen, what would you say is the government's relationship? Well, maybe I have two questions for you. What's the government's relationship to media, and what should the government's relationship be to media?
Well, the government's relationship to media in a liberal democracy should be one of separation. The media is there, is autonomous, is independent, and is there to hold power to account. And what should happen in an ideal world is that if governments are engaging in propaganda and deception, they get called out for it. Mm-hmm. The reality of Western media is that the media doesn't function. It manufactures consent, as well, that was actually Walter Lippmann's phrase from the early part of the 20th century. But media ends up manufacturing consent for elite interests, time and time again. So the system isn't working as it's supposed to be.
Here in North America and in Europe, I believe, there's a majority of the funding is coming from the government for a lot of the media outlets. And so it just seems hypocritical to try to keep them accountable, but they're also funding the existence of the news station.
Yeah, well, there are two aspects to media in liberal democracies. There is the public service broadcasting model, where in a sense that there is, media is funded through public money, mm-hmm. But within a framework which is structured by the government, but such as the BBC in the United Kingdom. But it's supposed to be notionally independent still, although it's being funded differently. In reality, I think most sort of close analyses of the BBC argue that ultimately it's not really very independent at all from the British state, and so on. So you have that issue, but then you have the commercial media. And of course, the criticism of the commercial media is that essentially you have a very small number of very large, powerful conglomerates dominating most of the mainstream media, and that those interests of those large conglomerates overlap with the interests of government and other powerful elites, and that creates ultimately a constraint, a powerful constraint on the media. It doesn't mean that the media all the time is towing the line, but it does mean that it operates within these broad parameters. And there might be contestation and challenge between elite groups, and you can see that reflecting in media coverage. But the broader sort of outer limits of media performance, it tends to be defined by the broad interest you see either in the major corporations or in government. And I mean, this is a very powerful insight from Daniel Hallin's work in Vietnam. He said that media moved into a realm of legitimate controversy, on Vietnam, when the hawks and the doves were publicly arguing in Washington. But before you had that, the media wouldn't touch the subject critically.
I guess why wouldn't they go there? Was it the fact that the government was heavy-handed with them or threatening funding, but why wouldn't the media in those instances hold them accountable, or why haven't they?
I mean, the factors which Herman and Chomsky identify is concentration of ownership, reliance upon advertising, that these create economic constraints on the media. The journalistic routine of relying upon official sources and elite sources rather than alternative sources. And then the question of ideology as well, that these filters reinforce each other to create a situation where sort of all the incentives, as it were, are working against holding power to account. And so unless there's, as it were, blocks within the elite who want an issue to be raised, journalists won't touch it. And you see this time and time again. You see topics which are simply too hot to touch. So there's a kind of a caution, a fear of going up against power. And actually, this comes to a very important point. Part of the answer to your question is that not only are the incentive structures there, and also the routines of journalism where they tend to go to elite sources, you also have the question of flack. This is something I've experienced personally. And what Herman and Chomsky mean by flack is that when people do start to ask questions which really go up against power, they get subjected to a huge level of criticism and attack. Yeah. Writing in the 80s, Herman and Chomsky referred to think tanks, for example, being mechanisms which would throw out flack. And I think that's probably changed in recent years, but you certainly find, and this has been my own personal experience when I started to look at the war in Syria, we found ourselves very, very rapidly being attacked by from a number of quarters, and then some very, very hostile media coverage against us, extremely hostile. And it was very clear that sort of, one, we were right over the target in the sense of an interesting research area, but also we were very aware that we were coming up against powerful interests. And so we were very severely attacked. So for all of those reasons, it's a tough job for a journalist to start to ask really challenging questions.
Well, for sure. You hear this phrase often, follow the money. So would you say that that's accurate?
Well, in a way, as I say, I think the strength of, for example, the propaganda model that Herman Chomsky drew together is that it argues that there's no one thing, or there's no one single factor which explains everything that you see. It's a combination of everything, ranging from ideology through to corporate interests shaping what journalists do, through to the routines of journalism, deference to official sources, and then fear of flack. That all of these things work, and it varies from issue to issue. I mean, if for example somebody wants to go up against Murdoch's vested interests, and that person happens to work for Sky, the economic constraints will come to the fore there. Yeah. But if somebody wants to come up against, for example, the Bush administration's claims about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, then they're going to find themselves feeling a lot of heat from the White House and from the think tanks around. And of course, this is what you saw on the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Scott Ritter, for example, former UN weapons inspector, was very vocal, but heavily criticized. Yeah. So in those situations, those factors come into play and make it very difficult to ask challenging questions. Not impossible, just very difficult.
For sure. So what would you say, one thing we're seeing a lot of is censorship, social media censorship, all sorts of kinds of censorship everywhere. Would you say that that's healthy, good, needed, or would you say that that's maybe a weapon of propaganda?
It's definitely a weapon of propaganda, and everything that we've been talking about, it's clear to me, as somebody who's spent a long time studying the media, that it has become progressively worse. That whatever constraints there were on the media during the Cold War, or sort of over last 10, 15 years after the collapse of communism, whatever the constraints were there then, and they were significant, things have become much, much worse in the last 5, 6 years, maybe 10 years. It's difficult actually, because I think we have so many moments, 9/11 through to global war on terror, and then with COVID, where you can see this progressive erosion of, in a sense, the autonomy of journalism and the ability of, even resource-wise, for mainstream media to support investigative journalism of a high quality. It becomes more and more what some people describe as churnalism, where they're simply repeating press briefings and so on and so forth. So it's become more and more difficult, to the point where we are now, where we've got essentially a growing legitimation and tolerance of censorship. Yeah. And in answer to your question, no, this is not a good thing. This is a very, very bad thing. And censorship can be seen, in a way, as the major part of big propaganda campaigns. Propaganda campaigns aren't just about promoting a particular understanding through, positive promotion, but it also involves shutting people up and stopping people from talking. Yeah, totally. And we have seen this very clearly with COVID-19 and big tech, obviously, censoring, deplatforming people. And we see it at the moment with the emergence of online harm legislation, which is still evolving, but it's running across multiple democracies.
Yeah.
Now, some of this seems to be going in the direction of attempting to redefine free speech in the sense of introducing a category of legal but harmful speech.
Yeah.
And bringing into that these notions of disinformation, malinformation, misinformation, and that these are sort of harmful forms of information which need to be regulated and controlled, essentially censored.
Because the scary thought about that is who is making those decisions, and that's the part that's just up in the air.
Exactly. Who makes the decision? And what we have seen is the emergence of what some people have described as the counter disinformation industry. And there are plenty of academics involved in this, as well as think tanks, NGOs, established themselves as arbiters of what is disinformation and what is information, what is legitimate. And
for sure.
This takes us into a world where powerful actors can resource NGOs to do the fact checking, define, say, a independent news outlet as a disseminator of disinformation. They're labeled as they're disseminating disinformation. That's harmful. It's disinformation about COVID, and you can see the kind of the pressure building up. And if you then have legislative moves which allow social media companies to be fined for having content which has been defined as disinformation, this takes us to a very dark place in democratic terms. This is not how the basic logic of free speech and democracy is. That, to go back to John Stuart Mill, you need to have all arguments aired and discussed, because you can never be absolutely sure which arguments are correct until you've allowed a full discussion.
Absolutely.
And even if somebody's got the wrong idea or the wrong argument, if you censor that, you stop the opportunity for other people being able to see that argument, to evaluate it, and then see it for what it is.
Yeah, I would love to get your take. What have we learned from COVID? Because it depends where you look. Some places are still preaching that this is the way it is and things are right, and then you look on the other side and it's completely the opposite. So what have we learned through this last couple of years of COVID?
Well, I think what we've learned, and Panda, but before I was involved with it, did a lot of good work in terms of pointing out the scientific issues surrounding COVID, that things such as lockdown, mask mandates, and so on, and claims about how dangerous the virus was were inaccurate. And so, we've learned a lot in the last year and a half. Some people learning much quicker that we've had an exaggeration of the threat levels, that these have been used to put in place policies such as mandates, injections, lockdowns, which have had a hugely negative impact, and that's putting it mildly, on our societies. And so we've learned that, but that's in a sense learning that there's been a lot of propagandization around this. But I think we have also seen, and I think more people than ever have seen, how very eminent, credible experts are subjected to smear campaigns, censorship, and how big a part propaganda can play in our societies. Because I think a lot of people have seen through the propaganda now. They've seen that it was exaggerated. They have seen eminent scientists being deplatformed. And of course, the Great Barrington Declaration is an excellent example of that. They essentially appear to have initiated a smear campaign against the Great Barrington Declaration, saying that we need to take down these fringe, they called them fringe scientists. And this is all in the public domain now. And I believe that there are legal cases now being pursued against the US government. And this, in a way, is an extraordinary learning moment, because people have seen, in a way that perhaps they haven't seen before for a long time, how propaganda works, how smear campaigns work. And I think, that's, in a sense, can create a huge amount of awareness and understanding amongst publics across democracies that, we have problems with propaganda, and the mainstream media doesn't really do the job it's supposed to, and nor does academia as well. Academics have been very slow to.
You're very right. Like, it feels as though the veil has kind of been pulled off of a majority of the public's eyes. At least I'd like to hope so, because like even in the preparation for this interview, in some of the people I was chatting with, one thing I decided to do was I Googled, is coffee bad for your eyes? And you look it up and it goes, coffee is bad for your eyes. It can cause blindness, blah, blah. Then I Googled, is coffee good for your eyes? And then I found coffee's great for vision, helps your eyes. And so, so the next question I started to ask was, who did that study? Who did that study? Who's paying them? Anyway, my thoughts on that is that the general population now is starting to ask the questions that they need to ask, because I think you're right. There's been such an eye-opening awakening almost of the masses, because it's just been so radicalized. It's just been so crazy over these last couple of years. In the last couple of minutes we have, what would you suggest that we do now? How do we proceed? How do we step into the future with our kids, our schools, our universities, even interpreting the news? What would you suggest?
Well, on the one hand, we need to fight any drives to increase the levels of censorship. If we lose open freedom of expression and debate, we lose democracy. Yeah. End of. And so we must struggle against that. Yeah. But having done that, hopefully successfully, we need to then look back at our institutions in society. We need to look back at our political systems. We need to look at our mass media, and we need to look at our academia, and to say, well, are these really functioning in the way they're supposed to be? Do we need to have a long, hard look at the structure of our media in order to find ways of creating greater independence and autonomy? Do we need to look at the way academia operates? And you raised the point of follow the money. Look at the funding streams. Yeah. Do we see academia being powerfully shaped and influenced by powerful backers? Mm-hmm. And I'd say the answer to that is yes. So really a root and branch reform of our institutions to, in a way, get them back to the way they're supposed to operate, or how we always thought they were operating. And that's a huge challenge for us. But I think it's a challenge that we need to grasp and not lose this opportunity now, because we don't want to blunder into the next state of emergency crisis where even more of our freedoms are taken away, and it becomes even potentially permanent, as some people have been suggesting. So we need to act now. Yeah. And in terms of how we approach media, I'm a great believer in the intelligence of most people. Most people have the skills, and if they can develop the confidence to think critically, think, where's this information coming from? Who might be supplying this, and so on, in terms of funding, etc. And that can go a long way, I think, to people becoming more critically aware, and ultimately more understanding of what's going on, and more able to hold their governments and their elected leaders to account, which is what democracy is all about, I think.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this interview. Do you have anywhere that we could maybe point people to, a website, or anywhere that they could grab your resources or kind of get insights on propaganda?
Well, certainly, I mean, if people go to the Panda website, it has a large amount of information, both on COVID, but also we have a series that we've launched on censorship, and there's material on propaganda there. There's my own organization for propaganda studies, which gives access to material. And I have my own WordPress site, which lists all my academic publications. But Organization for Propaganda Studies, and of course, Propaganda in Focus, which is a new online magazine we've set up. We've got about 28 authors, all writing about issues surrounding propaganda and so on. So that's a good place for people to go to. So those would be the first 3 ports of call, I think, for people.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today. This has been honestly incredibly insightful. Dr. Piers, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks for watching Return to Reason. I'd like to read your thoughts in the comments section below. And pay it forward. Share this video with someone. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so that you're notified every time I post a new video.